The Grand Council chamber of the Galactic Coalition stretched toward a crystalline dome ceiling, its sweeping architecture designed to make every species feel equally small. Towering holographic displays cast a pale blue glow across the assembled delegates, their faces, both human and alien, tense with anticipation. Staff Sergeant Jack Reynolds stood at parade rest, his dress blues immaculate, combat ribbons telling silent stories of Earth's recent conflicts. He represented humanity's military strength at this crucial diplomatic summit, though at 6 feet tall, he felt dwarfed by the massive Kravax delegation. High Commander Zarthak's scales rippled with barely contained disdain as he descended from his elevated podium. Each step of his digitigrade legs echoed through the chamber. Standing 9 feet tall, his ceremonial armor gleaming with conquered worlds' medals, he circled Reynolds like a predator sizing up prey. The human military application for alliance status is denied, Zarthak announced, his translator struggling to convey the full contempt in his subharmonics. Their bodies are soft, their bones brittle, their muscles inadequate. They hide behind machines because evolution abandoned them. A murmur rippled through the chamber. The Kravax's military might had helped forge the coalition, their combat prowess legendary across 3 spiral arms. Their opinion carried weight. Reynolds didn't flinch. His green eyes tracked Zarthak's movement with the steady gaze of a combat veteran who had seen worse than alien intimidation tactics. Look at this specimen, Zarthak continued, gesturing dismissively. No redundant organs, no natural armor, no claws. Their reaction speed is subpar. Their skin punctures at the slightest impact. They require artificial atmospheres on 90% of habitable worlds. He leaned down, bringing his razor-toothed maw close to Reynolds' face. They are prey species playing at being predators. The chamber's atmosphere grew thick with tension. Other species' representatives shifted uncomfortably, many having witnessed human military capabilities firsthand during joint operations. But none dared contradict the Kravax commander openly. Reynolds' lip quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but something more dangerous. His voice carried clearly through the chamber, calm and measured. Permission to respond, Council Speaker. The insectoid speaker's translator chimed. Granted, Staff Sergeant Reynolds. High Commander, Reynolds said, turning to face Zarthak directly, breaking protocol by meeting the alien's gaze. You've made several observations about human physiology. They're mostly accurate, if superficial, but you've missed something fundamental about humanity. Zarthak's neck frills flared. And what, pray, would that be? We're still here. Reynolds gestured to the chamber's historical markers. Humanity survived an ice age with nothing but sharpened sticks. We crossed oceans in wooden boats. We reached space in vessels that would horrify modern safety inspectors. While other species evolved natural weapons, we learned to turn everything into a tool. He took a step forward, causing Zarthak to pull back slightly. A subtle victory noticed by the chamber's more politically astute observers. You call us weak because we lack natural armor. We learned to make it. No claws. We forged better ones. Poor reaction time. We engineered solutions. Every limitation you've listed isn't a weakness. It's a challenge humanity has already overcome. The chamber had grown absolutely silent. Reynolds maintained his composure, but his next words carried an edge sharp enough to cut through Zarthak's practiced disdain. I formally request to demonstrate human capabilities through your species' traditional trials of combat worthiness. Gasps and mutters erupted. The Kravax trials were notorious. Their warrior case used them to cull the weak from their own ranks. No other species had ever been allowed to attempt them, let alone requested to do so. Zarthak's scales flushed dark with anger, or perhaps excitement. You would die in the first trial, human. Your flesh would tear, your bones would shatter, your blood would stain our sacred grounds. Then you have nothing to lose by accepting. Reynolds smiled now, the expression of a man sliding the final piece into a long-planned strategy. Unless you fear what it would mean if I succeeded, The challenge hung in the air like a drawn blade. Zarthak's reputation, his species' dominance of coalition military doctrine, and centuries of assumed superiority balanced on his response. I accept. Zarthak's claws clicked against his armor. When you break, human, it will remind the coalition why the Kravaks lead in matters of war. Reynolds nodded once, crisp and professional. When I succeed, Commander, it will teach the coalition why humans never learn to give up. The preparation chamber beneath the Kravaks combat arena smelled of metal and old blood. Reynolds sat on a duralloy bench, methodically checking his gear while a dozen alien observers watched through crystalline barriers. His standard-issue combat boots, reinforced utilities, and basic armor vest seemed painfully inadequate compared to the bio-enhanced battle suits worn by Kravaks warriors. The human refuses ceremonial combat enhancements, one observer whispered, mandibles clicking in disbelief. Is this pride or madness? Reynolds continued his equipment check, each movement precise and unhurried. 3 magazines of standard ammunition, combat knife, basic medical kit, and a canteen of water. The gear of a Marine who'd fought across a dozen worlds, nothing more. A shadow fell across him as Zarthak entered, flanked by 2 massive honor guards. Last chance to withdraw, human. The medical teams are excellent, but even they cannot reattach limbs that have been completely pulverized. Reynolds stood, rolling his shoulders. Interesting theory, Commander. But I've got a different one about these trials. He patted his vest pocket, where a small data chip contained months of research. See, I've studied every public record of Kravaks combat techniques. Analyzed every available footage of your trials. And I noticed something. Zarthak's neck frills twitched. Your research means nothing. The trials break even our strongest warriors. They break warriors who think like Kravaks, Reynolds countered. But humans, we specialize in changing the rules of engagement. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Did you know the average human can continue fighting with multiple broken bones? That we can stay conscious after losing 2 liters of blood. That our bodies produce emergency chemicals that can triple our normal strength. The honor guards shifted uneasily. Reynolds continued, each word carefully chosen. Your trials are designed to break warriors through overwhelming force. But humans, we broke ourselves thousands of times throughout history. Then we got back up and studied how to break our enemies more efficiently. A deep horn resonated through the chamber, signaling the approach of the first trial. Zarthak's scales darkened with barely contained rage. The arena will humble you, pray. The arena will learn what every human opponent discovers, Commander. Reynolds checked his knife one last time. We're not just survivors. We're professionals at turning the impossible into the inevitable. The massive doors began to slide open, revealing the roaring crowd above. Reynolds strode forward, but paused at the threshold. One more thing, Commander. I requested these trials 3 months ago through diplomatic channels. Everything since your insults, my response, this challenge, was planned. The real trial began the moment you thought you were in control. Before Zarthak could respond, Reynolds stepped into the light. The arena stretched before him, a nightmare of shifting terrain and hidden weapons. The crowd's roar became deafening as the human walked calmly to the center, his boots leaving prints in sand that had soaked up the blood of countless warriors. The announcement system boomed. First trial. Survival combat. Multiple opponents. No restrictions. Victory through survival or submission. 5 gates around the arena crashed open. Kravaks warriors emerged, each standing over 8 feet tall, their bodies enhanced with combat stimulants and ceremonial armor. They moved with predatory grace, spreading out to surround the seemingly vulnerable human. Reynolds reached down and grabbed a handful of arena sand, letting it filter through his fingers. He'd memorized the grain size from historical documents, perfect for reducing visibility and jamming enhanced optical systems. The warriors circled closer, their weapons humming with power. Begin. The command echoed across the arena. Reynolds smiled, the same dangerous smile from the council chamber. He'd spent 3 months preparing for this exact moment, studying every recorded trial, analyzing every pattern. The Kravaks expected a desperate fight for survival. Instead, they were about to learn why humans had turned combat into a science. The first warrior charge, and Reynolds moved to meet them. The real demonstration of human strength was about to begin. The first Kravaks warrior's charge ended in empty air as Reynolds rolled beneath the sweeping strike, scattering a handful of sand upward. The crystalline optical enhancers in the warrior's helm immediately tried to compensate, creating a millisecond of disorientation. That's all Reynolds needed. His combat knife found the gap between armor plates at the knee joint, a weakness he'd identified from studying injury reports. The warrior stumbled, surprise replacing confidence. The crowd's bloodthirsty roar faltered, replaced by murmurs of confusion. Precision over power, Reynolds muttered, already moving as 2 more warriors converged on his position. The arena's environmental controls kicked in, sending the temperature plummeting. Ice crystals formed on his armor, but Reynolds smiled. The Kravaks were cold-blooded. Their reactions would slow before his did. Surround and destroy, the lead warrior bellowed, his translator making the words sound like grinding stones. The human cannot watch all directions. Reynolds backed toward a terrain shift, counting steps. Actually, humans developed nearly 360-degree situational awareness as pursuit predators. He triggered a pressure plate he'd spotted earlier, causing a section of the arena floor to snap upward. We also really like setting traps. The rising platform caught one warrior mid-lunge, sending them sprawling. Reynolds spun, using their momentum to throw them into their companion. Both crashed down in a tangle of advanced armor and wounded pride. The temperature suddenly soared, turning the arena into a furnace. Sweat poured down Reynolds' face, but he'd trained for this. Humans were persistence hunters who'd evolved chasing prey until heat exhaustion brought it down. The Kravaks, with their heavy armor and biological cooling limitations, would suffer more. Your endurance has limits, human. A warrior charged through the heat haze, plasma blade humming. Reynolds sidestepped, noting how the warrior's movements had already slowed. The blade passed close enough to singe his uniform. Fun fact about human limits, Reynolds called out, his voice carrying across the arena. We're really bad at accepting them. He ducked another swing, closing distance. The first human marathoner died after running 26 miles to deliver a message. Now we run that distance for fun. The warrior's next attack was sluggish. Reynolds struck 3 precise points, joints he'd memorized from Kravak's medical diagrams. The massive alien dropped, armor systems whining as they tried to compensate. Only 2 warriors remained standing. They moved more cautiously now, respect replacing their initial disdain. The arena temperature plunged again, frost coating every surface. Reynolds' breath came out in clouds, but his movements stayed sharp. Your species dies in extreme cold, one warrior said, circling. Your blood freezes. Reynolds kept moving, generating heat. We survived an ice age with nothing but fur clothes and fire. He gestured at the fallen warriors. Your fancy armor does the work for you. We learned to adapt. The last 2 warriors attacked together, their coordination perfect. Reynolds dropped and rolled, letting their weapons clash above him. In close quarters, their size worked against them. He came up inside their guard, strikes targeting nerve clusters through gaps in their armor. Seconds later, it was over. 5 Kravaks warriors lay disabled but alive, their advanced armor systems blinking morning lights. Reynolds stood in the center of the arena, breath steady, knife still held in a perfect grip. The silence was absolute. Then, from the younger warriors section, a sound began. The rhythmic striking of claws against armor, the traditional Kravak salute to superior combat technique. Up in his observation booth, Zarthak's scales had darkened to nearly black. Impossible, he hissed. The human used no power armor, no combat enhancers. No, Reynolds responded, his voice carrying through the arena's acoustics. "I used something better. Knowledge. Strategy. Evolution gave you natural weapons, Commander. It gave us the ability to turn anything into one." He wiped his knife clean and resheathed it, "including your own assumptions about our weakness." The crowd's roar built to a crescendo as medical teams rushed to attend the fallen warriors. Reynolds turned toward the exit, then paused. "Oh, and Commander, that was me playing defensive. Shall we see what happens when humans actually decide to attack?" The urban combat simulator stretched across 3 square kilometers of artificial cityscape. Reynolds crouched in the shadow of a crumbling building, listening to the distant sounds of Kravak's hunter teams searching for him. Their heavy footsteps echoed off metal and stone. They weren't even trying to move quietly. "Primitive human architecture," one hunter growled through an open comm channel. "Their buildings lack proper defensive capabilities." Reynolds smiled, checking his ammunition. They'd missed the point entirely. Earth's cities weren't built for defense. They were built by survivors who kept rebuilding, no matter how many times disaster struck. A holographic sun cast harsh shadows across the rubble-strewn streets. Reynolds had spent the first hour mapping patrol patterns and watching the hunters' movements. Now it was time to change the game. "Target's blood trail leads north," another hunter reported. Consistent with injury sustained during initial engagement, Reynolds glanced at his deliberately bandaged arm. The shallow cut had stopped bleeding an hour ago, but the trail of drops he'd left would lead them exactly where he wanted. Humans hadn't evolved as the strongest predators on Earth. They'd evolved as the smartest. The first hunter team rounded the corner, weapons ready. Reynolds watched through a broken window as they followed his trail into the narrow alley. Their enhanced armor squeezed through the tight space, sensors sweeping for movement. "Hunter actual, target's trail ends here." The lid Kravak switched to thermal vision. No heat signature detected. Reynolds triggered the first trap. Debris cascaded from the rooftops, forcing the hunters to dodge. Their predictable movement patterns sent them straight into his kill zone. "Contact!" The rear guard shouted, firing at Reynolds' previous position, but he was already moving, using routes he plotted through the buildings. Humans had mastered urban warfare through centuries of city fighting. Every window was a firing position, every doorway an ambush point. "Multiple signatures," another hunter called out. "Target is using thermal decoys." "Correction," Reynolds spoke into their comm channel. "I'm using your own technology against you." He collected heat sinks from their dropped equipment during the first engagement, using them to create false trails. A hunter crashed through a wall, energy blade humming. Reynolds ducked under the swing and closed distance. In tight quarters, their size worked against them again. His knife found the same weak points he'd exploited in the arena. 2 units disabled, a commander reported. "Target is demonstrating knowledge of our armor configurations." Reynolds moved to his next position, voice calm on the channel. "Humans study their opponents. We learn. We adapt. Right now, you're all using standard Kravak's combat protocols, which means I know exactly how you'll react." 3 more hunters converged on his position, but Reynolds was already gone. He'd memorized the city layout during the briefing, noting how it matched historical combat zones from Earth's past conflicts. "Impossible," a hunter shouted as another team fell to precisely placed shots. "No species can predict combat patterns this accurately." "Pattern recognition kept us alive as a species," Reynolds replied, setting up his next ambush. Whether it was reading animal migrations or enemy troop movements, humans learned to see the logic in chaos. The remaining hunters tried to adapt, changing their tactics. But Reynolds had planned for this too. Each counter move drove them toward prepared positions, separating teams from their support. "All units, fall back and regroup," the commander ordered, finally recognizing the trap. But it was too late. Reynolds emerged from cover behind their command position. "Here's the difference between hunters and humans," he said, weapon trained on the commander. "You hunt for sport or food. We hunted to advance our understanding of warfare." The commander turned, but Reynolds was already moving. A precise strike disabled their command systems, leaving the remaining hunters without coordination. 10 minutes later, it was over. Every hunter team had been systematically disabled, their advanced armor transformed into expensive restraints. Reynolds stood in the center of the mock city as the simulation faded. "Commander Zarthak," he called out to the observation post. "You deployed 15 of your best hunters. I took them down using basic equipment and simple tactics. Still think humans are prey species." The only response was silence, and the growing sound of younger Kravax warriors pounding their approval on the chamber walls. The psychic amphitheater glowed with an eerie blue light, its crystalline walls designed to amplify mental energies. Reynolds sat cross-legged in the center, surrounded by 5 Kravax mind warriors. Their scaled heads bore ceremonial markings of the psychic caste, silver runes that pulsed with power. "The human mind is fragile," the lead psyker announced, voice resonating through the chamber. "We will show you true horror." Reynolds kept his breathing steady, remembering his training. Interesting choice, but humans have been practicing psychological warfare since before we had written language. The first mental assault hit like a tidal wave. Images of past battles flooded Reynolds' mind. The faces of fallen comrades, the sounds of dying men, the smell of burning flesh. The mind warriors expected him to break under the weight of his own trauma. Instead, Reynolds exhaled slowly. "We process trauma differently than Kravax," he said, voice unwavering. "Humans don't just survive their nightmares. We learn from them." The psychic pressure increased. The mind warriors dug deeper, pulling forth memories of his worst combat experiences. A battlefield on Mars where his unit was nearly wiped out. The civilian casualties during the Neptune colony crisis. The day he lost his best friend to a surprise attack. "Your species feels pain so deeply," one mind warrior observed. "Such rich emotional memory. It should be crippling." Reynolds opened his eyes, meeting their gaze. "You're right. We feel everything intensely. Pain, loss, fear. But that's not our weakness. It's our strength." He pushed back against their mental probe. "Every scar is a lesson. Every loss, a reason to improve." The mind warriors recoiled as Reynolds' memory shifted. They saw how each failure had led to better training protocols, how every loss had driven innovations in tactics and equipment, how human grief transformed into determination. "Impossible," the lead psyker hissed. "Your mind should be fracturing under this pressure." Reynolds stood, his mental defenses holding firm. "Humans spent millennia breaking ourselves to become stronger. We turned our greatest tragedies into fuel for advancement, our darkest moments into catalysts for change." The psychic assault intensified, but now the mind warriors found themselves caught in the complexity of human emotional responses. They witnessed how humans could laugh in the face of death, find hope in despair, and forge unbreakable bonds through shared hardship. "Your own psychological attacks are reflecting back," Reynolds explained, taking a step forward. "Because humans don't just feel emotions, we transform them. Fear becomes courage. Pain becomes resolve. Loss becomes purpose." One by one, the mind warriors withdrew, their silver runes dimming. Only the lead psyker remained, his mental probe now tinged with confusion. "Your species," the psyker struggled to understand. "You embrace suffering as a teacher." Reynolds nodded. "Every human carries a universe of pain and joy, failure and triumph. We don't break under the weight of our experiences, we build ourselves from them." The last psychic assault crumbled as the mind warriors encountered memories they couldn't process. Children learning from failure, soldiers becoming stronger through defeat, entire civilizations rising from ashes of destruction. "The trial is over," the lead psyker announced, scales pale with exhaustion. "We cannot break what has learned to rebuild itself from breaking." Reynolds rolled his shoulders, dispelling the lingering psychic pressure. "You tried to use my trauma against me. But humans learned long ago that our greatest wounds often become our greatest weapons. In the observation chamber, Zarthak watched with growing unease as his elite mind warriors bowed to their human opponent. He had expected Reynolds to crack under psychological pressure. Instead, the human had turned the trial into another demonstration of his species' unfathomable resilience. "Commander," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying clearly, "your warriors just learned something crucial about humans. We don't fear the darkness of our minds. We've made it our ally. Ready for the next trial." The preparation chamber buzzed with unusual activity as Reynolds checked his equipment for the next trial. Young Kravax warriors lined the observation windows, their scales bright with excitement, a stark contrast to the darker hues of their older superiors. "The human fights with honor," one young warrior declared, loud enough to carry. "He disables rather than kills, shows mercy when victory is assured." A veteran commander whirled on the speaker. "Mercy is weakness. The old ways haven't won him a single trial." Another youth interrupted, breaking centuries of hierarchical tradition. The chamber fell silent at this unprecedented challenge to authority. Reynolds continued his equipment check, hiding a knowing smile. He'd counted on this generational divide. Young species were always more adaptable than their elders. Zarthak burst into the chamber, his scales almost black with rage. "The next trial has been modified," he announced. "The human will face the ravine of blades. No one has survived its crossing in 50 years." Murmurs of protest arose from the younger warriors. The ravine was an execution ground, not a trial arena. Its automated weapons systems and environmental hazards were designed for public executions of traitors. "Commander," Reynolds spoke calmly, loading fresh magazines, "you're breaking your own warrior code. These trials have rules." "Rules can be modified by command authority," Zarthak snarled, "unless you wish to withdraw." Reynolds stood, facing the massive alien. "Humans have a saying. When they go low, we go high. You're changing the rules because you're afraid. Not of me, but of what I represent." A young Kravax warrior stepped forward, breaking ranks. "Commander, I formally protest this modification. The human has earned the right to fair trials." "Silence." Zarthak's tail lashed out, striking the young warrior across the face. Blood spattered the chamber floor. Reynolds moved without hesitation. He crossed the space between them, medical kit already in hand. The chamber went deadly quiet as he began treating the young warrior's wound. "In human combat units," Reynolds spoke while he worked, voice carrying to every corner of the chamber, "we judge leaders not by their strength, but by how they treat those under their command." More young warriors moved forward, forming a protective circle around their wounded comrade. Older veterans shifted uncertainly, centuries of conditioning warring with the evidence before them. "You dare lecture us on leadership?" Zarthak's claws extended. "Your species can barely control its own planet." Reynolds finished bandaging the wound, then turned to face the commander. "We don't seek to control, Commander. We learn. We adapt. We evolve." He gestured to the gathered warriors, "just like your young ones are doing now." "These trials were meant to prove human weakness," Zarthak hissed. "Instead, you corrupt our warriors with your inferior ideas." "No," the wounded young warrior spoke up, touching his bandaged face. "He shows us new strength, the strength to question, to change, to become better." The chamber erupted in discussion, younger warriors openly debating with veterans. Centuries of rigid hierarchy crumbled in minutes as new ideas clashed with old doctrine. "You see, Commander," Reynolds stepped forward, "humans don't just adapt ourselves. We catalyze adaptation in others. It's why we've survived every catastrophe our world threw at us. We learn, we teach, we grow, together." Zarthak's response was cut off by a thundering sound. Throughout the chamber, young warriors began striking their chest plates in rhythm, an ancient gesture of support traditionally reserved for revolutionary leaders. "Enough," Zarthak roared. "Clear the chamber. The human will face the ravine trial alone." As the warriors filed out, many brushed their claws across their foreheads, a subtle gesture of respect that hadn't been used in generations. Reynolds had awakened something that couldn't be contained by force or tradition. "I'll see you at the ravine, Commander," Reynolds called after Zarthak's retreating form. "And remember, humans don't just survive impossible situations. We turn them into opportunities for change." The ravine of blades stretched before Reynolds like a metallic wound in the earth. Automated weapon systems glinted in the artificial sunlight, while force fields crackled between floating platforms, the only path across the chasm. The crowd filling the observation galleries had grown to include representatives from every coalition species. "This trial is a perversion of our traditions," a young Kravax warrior shouted from the stands. Others took up the cry, but Zarthak silenced them with a gesture. "The human claims to understand our ways," the commander's voice boomed across the arena. "Let him prove it here, where our greatest enemies met their end." Reynolds studied the ravine's defense grid, noting the weapon placement patterns. "You know what humans call a place like this, Commander? A puzzle to be solved." Zarthak's response was to leap down into the arena, his ceremonial armor replaced with combat gear. "Then solve it with me in it, pray." The massive alien drew 2 energy blades, their edges humming with lethal power. Breaking protocol again. Reynolds checked his minimal equipment, or finally admitting you need to handle this personally. "Your corruption of our young warriors ends here." Zarthak charged, covering the distance with frightening speed. Reynolds rolled under the first slash, letting momentum carry him onto the nearest platform. "They're not corrupted, Commander. They're evolving, just like humanity did, one challenge at a time." The automated weapons activated, filling the air with energy bolts. Reynolds moved through them in a practiced dance, each step calculated from his study of Kravax execution records. Zarthak followed, his superior reach and strength forcing Reynolds to stay mobile. "You claim to understand evolution." Zarthak's blade shattered a platform edge. "Our species spent millennia becoming perfect warriors." Reynolds vaulted to another platform, using the defender turret's firing patterns to control Zarthak's approach angles. "Perfect? No, you stopped evolving because you thought you were perfect. Humans never made that mistake." A blade passed inches from Reynolds' throat. He countered with his combat knife, targeting the same armor weak points he'd identified in earlier trials. Zarthak howled as the blade found its mark. "Impossible." The commander's next attack carried crushing force. "You're using our own combat data against us. Every trial taught me more about your weaknesses," Reynolds confirmed, sliding under another slash. "Humans don't just learn from our victories, Commander. We learn from every moment, win or lose." The battle moved across the ravine, both warriors dodging automated fire. Reynolds led them through a complex pattern, using the defense grid itself to restrict Zarthak's movement options. "Your species is chaos." Zarthak's attacks grew more frenzied. No discipline, no genetic purity, no perfect form. Reynolds caught one of the energy blades with his knife, the specially treated steel holding just long enough. "We're not chaos, Commander. We're adaptation given form. Every weakness overcome, every challenge faced, every failure turned into a lesson." In the stands, young warriors watched in awe as Reynolds systematically dismantled their commander's perfect technique. Each move demonstrated principles they'd never considered: efficiency over power, precision over brute force. "You could have killed me 5 times now," Zarthak realized, scales paling. "Why show mercy?" Reynolds disabled Zarthak's second blade with a precise strike. "Because humans learned that true strength isn't about destroying your opponents. It's about showing them a better way." The final exchange happened in seconds. Reynolds slipped past Zarthak's guard, his knife finding 3 precise points that disabled the commander's armor systems. The massive alien crashed to his knees, immobilized but unharmed. "The trial is over," Reynolds announced, his voice carrying to the silent crowd. "And I didn't just survive your ravine, Commander. I proved that humanity's greatest weapon isn't our ability to kill, It's our ability to turn enemies into allies through understanding. The young warriors erupted in thunderous approval. Even some veterans joined in, recognizing that they had witnessed not just combat, but evolution in action. Reynolds helped Zarthak to his feet, ready to learn some new ways of thinking about strength, Commander. The Grand Council chamber felt different now. Where crystalline walls once inspired awe through intimidation, they now seemed to glow with possibility. Reynolds stood at attention, his slightly scorched dress blues a stark contrast to the elaborate alien formal wear surrounding him. The trials have concluded, the council speaker announced, their multifaceted eyes scanning the assembled delegates. Never in coalition history has a challenge so thoroughly transformed our understanding of strength. Zarthak stepped forward, his formal armor now bearing the marks of combat, left unrepaired as a reminder. I stand before the council to formally retract my opposition to human military alliance status. His scales shifted to deep blue, indicating profound respect. But more importantly, I stand to acknowledge a truth that we had forgotten. Young warriors lined the chamber walls, their scales bright with anticipation. Among them stood the one Reynolds had treated, his facial scar now a badge of honor rather than shame. The human warrior showed us that true strength isn't about remaining unchanging, Zarthak continued. It's about endless adaptation, not just surviving challenges, but learning from them, growing through them. Reynolds maintained his parade rest stance, but his eyes met those of various coalition species. Each had watched the trials, seen how human ingenuity and adaptability could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, the council speaker's translator, chimed. You have earned more than military alliance status for Earth. You have initiated what our historians are already calling the Great Evolution, a fundamental shift in how the coalition approaches combat doctrine and leadership. Permission to speak freely, Reynolds requested. At the speaker's nod, he continued, what you saw in those trials wasn't just one human's capability. It was the culmination of humanity's entire journey. Every battle we fought, every hardship we endured, every lesson we learned, all of it taught us that true strength comes from growth, not dominance. A young Kravax warrior stepped forward, breaking traditional protocol. We request that Sergeant Reynolds become the first human instructor in our warrior training program. Our young ones must learn this new way. The chamber erupted in discussion. Other species representatives began making similar requests, recognizing the value of human tactical and philosophical approaches. Zarthak raised his hands for silence. I support these requests, but with a modification. He turned to Reynolds. You showed mercy when you could have taken my life, taught lessons when you could have claimed vengeance. These are not just combat techniques. They are principles that could reshape our entire coalition. The council speaker's appendages moved in agreement. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, we offer you a broader role, not just as a military instructor, but as the first human liaison for coalition combat evolution. You will help bridge the gap between species, teaching and learning ways to combine our different strengths. Reynolds allowed himself a small smile. On one condition, council speaker. He gestured to the chamber. This program must be open to all coalition species, not just warriors. Humans learn that our greatest achievements come when we share knowledge across all boundaries. Granted, the speaker confirmed. And your first class already awaits. They indicated the gathered young warriors, who stood straighter under attention. Commander Zarthak, Reynolds turned to his former opponent. Would you do me the honor of being my first student? There's an old human saying, the strongest leaders are those who never stop learning. Zarthak placed a massive hand on Reynolds' shoulder, a gesture of warrior bond, never before offered to a non-Kravax. I would be honored, teacher. As the chamber filled with approving sounds from a dozen species, Reynolds reflected on humanity's journey. From cave-dwelling primates to starfaring civilization, they had survived through endless adaptation. Now, those same qualities would help forge a stronger coalition. Let's begin, Reynolds announced to the chamber. Lesson 1. True strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about how you rebuild yourself stronger after every challenge. The coalition would never be the same, and humanity had proven, once again, that their greatest power wasn't in their weapons or technology, but in their ability to turn every challenge into an opportunity for growth, not just for themselves, but for all those around them.